the end of the day, it's I think the humility that you referenced, Austin, at the beginning. I think that's one of the key points to end on.
Yeah, like we don't know what tomorrow holds, and we don't know where this is going. We don't know even in this year. I mean, if we look back at what happened in 2025, how you started 2025 and how you ended 2025, I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. And I think it's going to just be more and more true with each passing year. So just hold on tight and keep listening to this podcast because we'll guide you along the way.
Hello and welcome to a special summer episode of What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble. I am an adjunct professor at Heritage College and Seminary, as well as a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham. And I'm joined with Joel Jacob, principal product manager at Splunk, and Austin Gravely, and he is a pastor.
Gravely.
Gravely, yeah, I knew it, Gravely.
You knew it.
It's the first time in a long time that I made that mistake.
You've got a long streak. You had a long streak.
It's true. And joining us today is Andrew Wilson, but with an asterisk, because here's the deal. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I went out to London to go to my school, and I reached out to him. I was like, hey, maybe could record a quick episode in person, but I know you're super busy and I know his family situation because he's written about it. So I was like, you can say no. And he said no. And so he turned me down that time, and I didn't want to bother him, but I love his book, Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. It's an excellent book, and it's written, yes, by a Christian and a pastor, but he's a historian, and he has gone through a deep dive of a bunch of different things that happened all in 1 year. And one of the things he talks about, one of the main things, in addition to maps, patriots, skeptics, lovers, prophets, all these different things, roots, quirks, he argues, unlike others, that it's not just about the rise of weird culture in 1776, it's a rise of weirder culture. And he talks about ex-Christian is the E, and romantic, the R. Those are key aspects to what changed in 1776. People make a big deal sometimes about 1971 and what changed in 1971. But the biggest change in history, arguably, other than like the death and resurrection of Jesus, but from a daily living standpoint, is 1776. And so for him to join us today, we got permission from Crossway, shout out to Crossway, to just play a chapter of his book. So we're going to play the chapter that he focuses in on technology. It's called Machines Becoming Industrialized. And so we're going to listen to it, and then we're going to respond to it. So you can listen along with us now to the book, Remaking the World by Andrew Wilson.
Chapter 7. Machines Becoming Industrialized. Beneath the northwest viewing platform on the premier etage of the Eiffel Tower, engraved in golden letters 2 feet high, is the word Lavoisier. Western Paris is an advert for industrialization, and the Eiffel Tower is its icon. Conjured out of nothing but wrought iron, engineering, and thrusting ambition, it was the high point of an industrial overhaul that lasted half a century, carpeting Paris with new roads, sewers, public buildings, and railway stations, and transforming it from the city of Les Miserables to that of the Belle Époque. So when it was completed in 1889 as an invocation of science, Gustave Eiffel decided to engrave the names of 72 French scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and industrialists on the frieze beneath the first floor, as a tribute to those who had made his tower and the industrialization of France possible. The earliest, greatest, and most colourful of the 72 men, and the only one to be separated from his head on 2 separate occasions, was the father of modern chemistry, Antoine Lavoisier. Lavoisier was the great pioneer of the chemical revolution. His first work, an investigation of what we now call carbon dioxide, was translated into English in 1776. He subsequently isolated and named both oxygen and hydrogen, demonstrated that sulfur was an element and that water was not, predicted the existence of silicon, transformed the way people think about the chemistry of combustion, including the proposal that respiration and combustion were essentially the same thing, and confirmed the law of the conservation of mass. His binomial system for naming chemicals, based on the Linnaean system in biology, is why we call it copper sulfate instead of vitriol of Venus to this day. His personal life was equally eventful. He married Marie-Anne Paulze, later a significant chemist in her own right, when she was just 14, to help her escape the suit of a lecherous 50-year-old count, whom she regarded as a fool and an ogre. As chairman of the Commission on Weights and Measures, He was responsible for the adoption of the metric system. When he was honoured with a giant Parisian statue in 1900, the sculptor gave him someone else's head by mistake, confusing him with the Marquis de Condorcet. In a curious coincidence, the Americans did the exact opposite, even though the two men don't look very similar. The bust of Condorcet in Philadelphia is actually Lavoisier. And this was the second time Lavoisier had lost his head. At the height of the terror, he was accused of defrauding the state and sent to the guillotine on May the 8th, 1794. It only took them a moment to cut off this head, a fellow scientist lamented the following day, and 100 years might not be enough to reproduce an equivalent. The charges against him were clearly politically motivated: tax farming, stealing from the treasury, diluting the quality of tobacco, corresponding with foreign scientists, and they were eventually retracted after his death. The judge himself was executed a few weeks later. But one of those charges, as innocuous as it sounds today, was essentially accurate. Lavoisier had been writing letters to the lunar men. For every Paris, advertising the benefits of industrialization with its railways, boulevards, iron and glass, there was a Manchester. It's hard to overstate how shocked people were by the filth, clatter, gloom and stench of Manchester's dark, satanic mills. "The town is abominably filthy," remarked a visitor in 1808. "The steam engine is pestiferous, the dye-houses noisome and offensive, and the water of the river as black as ink." Alexis de Tocqueville, the greatest travel writer of his generation, was horrified by the, quote, "noise of furnaces, the whistle of steam," but more so by the state of the people. Quote, "Humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish. Here civilization works its miracles, and civilized man is turned back almost into a savage." The philosopher Hippolyte Taine agreed, describing the city as, quote, "a large bazaar for the sale of low-priced goods, a workhouse to accommodate 400,000 persons, a prison for convicts condemned to penal servitude." So did the American Henry Coleman, who saw, quote, "wretched, defrauded, oppressed, crushed human nature lying in bleeding fragments all over the face of society." For many who encountered Manchester in the industrial age, the vileness could be expressed only through metaphor. For General Charles Napier, it was the chimney of the world, in which soot had mixed with rain and formed a paste. Quote, "The only view is a long chimney. What a place! The entrance to hell realized." The Swedish novelist Fredrika Bremer called it, quote, "that queen of spiders, surrounded by a mass of ugly houses and factories, veiled in a thick cloud of rain, not unlike a spider's web. It produced a dark, oppressive impression on me." Friedrich Engels was blunter. "It was hell upon earth," he said. Engels had been sent to Manchester to cure him of his radical beliefs, but seeing industrial capitalism firsthand had precisely the opposite effect. 3 years later, he wrote the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx. Despite the horrific conditions of industrial cities, a great many people still moved there. Manchester grew from a market town of around 10,000 people in 1715 to a massive city of 400,000 by 1860, and twice that 50 years later. The explanation for this was infamously summarized by a middle-class man who heard Engels lamenting the condition of the city. Quote, "And yet there is a great deal of money made here. Good morning, sir." Manchester prospered because it became Cottonopolis, the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution, with all the wealth and jobs that it generated. And this happened as a result of two things that were built in 1776. One was Richard Arkwright's massive second cotton mill at Cromford in Derbyshire. 7 stories high and 130 feet long, and with every part of the process mechanized for the first time, it was built with a row of terraced houses for his workers. 6 years later, Arkwright would open his first mill in Manchester, and within a century there would be 100 mills in the city, accounting for a staggering 30% of the world's cotton production. The other was the Bridgewater Canal, which connected Manchester by water to Liverpool and hence to the oceans of the world. That combination of mechanized production and easy access to raw cotton and international markets, in a region that already had an abundance of skilled spinners and weavers, secured her position as a global manufacturing center. It also created living conditions of unspeakable squalor for many of her inhabitants. "From this filthy sewer, pure gold flows," wrote Tocqueville. He was talking about Manchester, but he could have been talking about industrialization in general. All of us are beneficiaries of the gold, the Eiffel Tower, the cotton we're wearing right now, and the dramatic changes in power, transport, communications, and productivity that have so enhanced human welfare in the last 250 years. But we also know about the sewers from which it flowed. We all know who picked the cotton, who swept the chimneys, who lost their lands, lives, or livelihoods, and who was beating or even shooting them at the time. Industrialization, like Enlightenment, was riddled with ambiguities. We will return to that in Chapter 9. In the meantime, there's a striking parable of industrialization in another transport link that opened between Liverpool and Manchester on September the 15th, 1830. It was the official launch of the world's first passenger railway. Large crowds watched as Robert Stephenson's new steam engine, Northumbria, left Liverpool, pulling a train with passengers including the Duke of Wellington, hero of Waterloo and now Prime Minister, and the local Member of Parliament, William Huskisson. Following the Northumbria on a parallel track was Stephenson's more famous engine, Rocket. When Northumbria stopped to take on water, many of the guests got out to stretch their legs. Huskisson, hoping to be reconciled to the Prime Minister after a political disagreement, approached Wellington's carriage to shake his hand. But before he was able to climb aboard, Rocket appeared in the distance on the adjacent track. Rocket was a prototype and didn't have brakes. The driver immediately changed into reverse, but it took a vital 10 seconds to engage. Several people shouted to Huskisson to move out of the way. Although there was plenty of time to reach safety, Huskisson hesitated between the tracks and then tried to avoid Rocket by clambering into the Duke's carriage. There were no fixed steps, so he tried to haul himself up by the carriage door. At the last minute, the door swung open, with Huskisson still holding it, straight in front of the oncoming Rocket. His leg was horribly mangled, and despite a valiant effort to get him medical care in time, the Northumbrian travelled towards Manchester at 36 miles an hour for 15 miles, breaking the world's speed record in the process. He died of blood loss that evening. The story made headlines everywhere. Industrialization brought unprecedented power, but it also brought death. In the pocket of Huskisson's jacket when he died was a tribute to the man who had made steam travel possible, and thus, ironically, Huskisson's own death. The man in question, who was also, as it happens, one of the lunar men to whom Lavoisier had been writing, was a Scottish inventor named James Watt. Watt's steam engine, like Arkwright's mill and the Bridgewater Canal, was launched commercially in 1776. Taken together, those three breakthroughs make 1776 a pretty good starting point for the Industrial Revolution. It was also the year that Watt, his business partner, and a number of other key figures in the history of industrialization began meeting regularly for dinner on the Monday nearest the full moon, calling themselves the Lunar Society. At the center of the lunar circle was the friendship between Birmingham manufacturer Matthew Boulton and the physician Erasmus Darwin from nearby Lichfield. The union of these two men, and these two towns, encapsulates the marriage of theoretical science and practical industry that would characterize the lunar men, and indeed the British Industrial Revolution as a whole. Samuel Johnson, who was from Lichfield himself, mischievously described the relationship between the two towns in 1776. Quote, "Sir, we are a city of philosophers. We work with our heads and make the boobies of Birmingham work for us with their hands." But the Lunar Society would bring the philosophers and the boobies together. The heads of leading scientists, in combination with the hands of leading manufacturers, would have powerful consequences, as ideas, instruments, investments, and inventions flowed between them. In practice, most of the lunar men transcended that divide. John Whitehurst, whom we met in Chapter 5, made clocks and wrote books about geology. Samuel Galton was a gunsmith who made groundbreaking discoveries on optics, light, and color. Darwin wrote Zoonomia, but he also wrote to Boulton with detailed sketches of his, quote, scheme for a fiery chariot. Today we would call it a car. James Keir was a chemist and geologist who managed a glassworks, ran Bolton and Watt's factory for a few years, and then made his fortune manufacturing soap. Watt, best known as an inventor, was an early pioneer in the chemical properties of water. Nevertheless, the genius of the group lay in the combination of theoretical and practical skills, with the research of one member triggering an innovation by another, which could then fuel the research of another, and so on. To take one example of many, Joseph Priestley's work on gases shaped Josiah Wedgwood's process for making ceramics, which enabled him to help Keir understand the gravity of glass and thereby make clearer lenses, which he then sold to Bolton for use in his factory, which was producing Watt's engines. Geology, chemistry, and industry were interconnected. Manufacturing was impossible without minerals, gases, and heat. Chemistry and geology were impossible without tools, precision instruments, and increasingly, power. The synergy between these lunar interests was captured nicely in a letter from Darwin to Bolton after visiting caves in Derbyshire with John Whitehurst. Quote, "I have been into the bowels of old Mother Earth and seen wonders and learnt much curious knowledge in the regions of darkness, and am going to make innumerable experiments on aqueous, sulphureous, metallic, and saline vapours, food for fire engines." The possibilities of chemistry in particular were very exciting. Of the 118 elements in a periodic table today, fewer than 15 had been known in 1700. The middle of the century saw 4 new metals identified: platinum, cobalt, nickel, and magnesium, alongside significant improvements in the production of iron and steel. But things really took off in the 1770s, and the lunar men were at the heart of it. Watt was studying latent heat as part of his work on steam. Small and Bolton were working on new metals, including manganese, which was first isolated in 1774 and would soon become indispensable in steelmaking. James Keir was researching alkalis, which were needed in the manufacture of soap, textiles, glass, and pottery. In a busy 1776, he published a seminal article on crystallization in glass, as well as translating Pierre-Joseph Macquar's Dictionary of Chemistry, to which he added his own work as an appendix the following year. Most significantly, Joseph Priestley was making a series of extraordinary discoveries about air, which he wrote up in his Experiments and Observations on Different Kinds of Air, 1774-7. If you put a mouse in a jar with pure air, or what we call oxygen, it can survive for twice as long as it does with common air. If you put a sprig of mint in a jar with putrid air, caused by the decay of a dead mouse, the mint grows better than it does normally. If you put the mouse and the mint in the same jar, they both survive indefinitely, which suggests a symbiotic relationship between animal and plant respiration, a fact that prompted Benjamin Franklin to remark, as presciently as ever, "I hope this will give some check to the rage to destroying trees that grow near houses." If you take the air that results from fermentation and impregnate water with it, you can create fizzy drinks, which combine a pleasant acidic taste with apparent medicinal benefits. This was one of Priestley's favourite discoveries, and a source of great personal pride. He spent 10 pages refuting the charge that it possessed, quote, "a strange urinous flavour." Soda water quickly caught the attention of a Swiss-German watchmaker named Johann Jakob Schweppe, who began mass-producing it. Bolton and Darwin were particular fans. It even went around the world on HMS Resolution. Experiments on airs, or what we now call gases, were taking place all over Europe in the 1770s. We have already seen that Alessandro Volta discovered methane in Italy. Chlorine was identified by Carl Wilhelm Scheele in Sweden. Priestley discovered sulfur dioxide in England, where Henry Cavendish had just produced inflammable air. Scheele was the first to produce fire air in 1771, and a year later Daniel Rutherford isolated noxious air in Scotland, which is where Joseph Black had previously studied fixed air. Eventually, Lavoisier, in France, described how these last 4 gases, and combustion itself, actually worked, and it was his approach to naming and classifying them that was ultimately adopted. We now know them as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide. This presents us with a puzzle, however. Scientific discoveries were proliferating across Europe in the late 18th century. New metals and gases were identified in Austria, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Sweden in the decades either side of 1776, to say nothing of the developments in Holland, Russia, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Yet it was only in Britain that they became, in Darwin's phrase, food for fire engines, Clearly, industrialization was not an inevitable result of scientific progress. The lunar men made engines and factories, while the French made hot air balloons, the Austrians made music, and the Dutch did not make much of anything for the next few decades. So why did the Industrial Revolution start in Britain? And why now? It's a vast question, one of the most important in economic history. But in simplistic terms, we can distinguish between deep and shallow causes. The deep causes, the factors that, over multiple centuries and indeed millennia, caused the breakthrough to happen in early modern Western Europe as opposed to elsewhere in history or elsewhere in the world, will have to wait until Chapter 9. The shallow causes are slightly easier to define because they relate to what triggered industrialization in 18th century England in particular. The reasons why, as Robert Allen puts it, there was only one route to the 20th century, and it traversed northern Britain. If we narrow our focus to that question, then we can answer it in terms of three interlocking stories, all of which collide in 1776, and all of which feature members of the Lunar Society in a starring role. They are the stories of power, of manufacturing, and of invention. Until 1700, only three sources of useful power were available to human beings. Anyone hoping to move something, to lift an object, pull a plough, grind wheat into flour, crush ore, pump water, transport goods, or operate machinery, had to power it using the wind, or a river, or muscles. The wind was good for certain things, but its inconsistency of availability, speed, and direction made it hard to harness for most human activity. Rivers were much steadier, but you couldn't take them with you, so mills, pumps, looms, and the like had to be built in very specific places. The only other option was to use muscles. Either you got an animal to work for you, in which case you had to provide it with food, land, and rest, or you paid or forced a person to work for you, or you did the work yourself. The 17th century saw a lot of attention given to the possibility of a fourth source of power: nothing. For 2,000 years, educated opinion in Europe had mostly agreed with Aristotle that vacuums, or voids, didn't and couldn't exist. Nature abhors a vacuum, as Rabelais quotably put it. But this consensus began to crumble in the 1640s and 1650s, as the possibility and power of vacuums became apparent. Evangelista Torricelli demonstrated that a sealed tube filled with mercury would create a vacuum at the top as it emptied, thus inventing the barometer, almost by accident. Otto von Guericke built the first vacuum pump with a design that was subsequently improved by Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke. Before long, it had demonstrated the power of vacuums in the most dramatic fashion, as people gathered in Magdeburg in central Germany to watch a team of horses try to pull apart two empty copper hemispheres. In front of a large crowd, including the Holy Roman Emperor, they failed, and in doing so showed just how powerful nothing could be. In and of itself, this was more spectacular than useful, but it coincided with increasing interest in the possibilities of steam, and whether it might one day be capable of pumping water out of mines, running mills, or even propelling vehicles. It was fairly obvious that water expanded when it boiled. Steam fills roughly 1,800 times more space than the equivalent amount of water, and that steam could therefore produce enough push to raise a piston in a cylinder. But the real power came from the realization that the reverse was also true. When the steam condensed back into water, it became 1,800 times smaller, creating a vacuum within the cylinder that would pull the piston back down again with terrific force. Steam could be used to make vacuums, which could be used to make power. That basic insight belonged to a French Huguenot, Denis Papin, so it might be strange that the idea was taken forward in Britain rather than France. But the reign of Louis XIV was a torrid time for French Protestants, and Papin spent his most productive years in Italy, Germany, and particularly England. It was in London that he invented the pressure cooker, giving it the rather macabre name of bone digester, and in London that he worked alongside both Hooke and Boyle in the Royal Society. And it was in London that in 1699 the Royal Society saw the first demonstration of a working steam-powered pump, Thomas Savery's, quote, new invention for raising of water and occasioning motion to all sorts of millwork by the impellent force of fire. It was dangerous, prohibitively inefficient, incapable of pulling anything other than water, and incapable of pulling it more than 10 meters upward. But in a country with cold winters, diminishing supplies of wood, and plentiful supplies of cheap coal, if only it could be mined efficiently, it was a start. 200 miles to the southwest, a Baptist preacher and ironmonger named Thomas Newcomen was working on his own project, which would eventually become the first steam engine. The key challenge, Newcomen realized, was not the push, but the pull. It was easy enough to heat water into steam, raise a piston in a cylinder, and lift a wooden beam. But it was far more difficult to cool the steam back into water, thus creating the vacuum needed to bring the beam back down, let alone to do this quickly enough and securely enough to make the engine run continuously. After 10 years of fiddling, Newcomen finally stumbled across the solution quite by accident, as a tiny hole caused cold water to rush into the cylinder, condensing the steam immediately and causing a blast of tremendous power that broke the chain, crushed the bottom of the cylinder, and, quote, convinced the very senses of the onlookers that they had discovered an incomparably powerful force which had hitherto been entirely unknown in nature. It was a genuine breakthrough, and the first steam engine was built near Birmingham in 1712. By 1776, there were 600 of them, draining mines across Britain, Europe, and even America. When Newcomen died, his only obituary remembered him as the sole inventor of that surprising machine for raising water by fire. Steam power was now possible. But outside of draining coal mines, it was thoroughly impractical and would remain so for another 60 years. Newcomen's engine was so inefficient and used so much coal relative to the amount of water it drained that to use it anywhere other than a coal mine would have been a complete waste of money. Various tweaks were made to the design, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem. The vast majority of the heat in the system was wasted. Water had to be boiled into steam and then condensed back into water in the same cylinder, which was spectacularly inefficient in terms of heat, coal, and cost. Consequently, until James Watt, there was no way that steam could be used to power mills or machinery, let alone Darwin's fire engines. A radical new idea was needed. Watt's solution came to him gradually and then suddenly. He worked on steam throughout the 1760s, researching latent heat while becoming increasingly frustrated with the Newcomen engine that he'd been asked to fix. But the key innovation, cooling the steam in a separate cold condenser, came to him in a flash of inspiration in 1765. Quote, "It was in the green of Glasgow. I was thinking upon the engine at the time and had gone as far as the herd's house when the idea came into my mind that as steam was an elastic body, it would rush into a vacuum. And if a communication was made between the cylinder and an exhausted vessel, it would rush into it and might be there condensed without cooling the cylinder. I then saw that I must get quit of the condensed steam and injection water if I used a jet as in Newcomen's engine. I hadn't walked further than the golf house when the whole thing was arranged in my mind." Like most great innovations, it seems very obvious afterwards. The way to avoid the continuous cycle of heating and cooling, with all its inefficiency, was to make the engine both hot and cold at the same time, but with the hot and cold parts kept separate, connected through valves and a pipe. But its implications were seismic. If it could be made to work, it would cut the amount of fuel needed by up to 75%, dramatically increase the cost-effectiveness of steam power, and make it useful in a variety of other settings, not just in coal mines. Watt was convinced that it could. "I've now made an engine that shall not waste a particle of steam," he proclaimed in 1765, before he had even built it. "It shall all be boiling hot, aye, and hot water injected, if I please." 10 years later, he had designed the engine, made a prototype, patented it, and gone into business with Bolton to build it. The first one started running at Bloomfield Colliery on March the 8th, 1776. It drained the pit of nearly 60 feet of water in under an hour. The new engine caught on quickly. A second opened at an ironworks in Shropshire in April, then another at a London distillery in the summer, then another at a colliery in Warwickshire. The first engines for the Cornish tin and copper mines, a vast potential market which would see 40 engines installed in the first 10 years, were ordered in November. Bolton could see the window of opportunity opening. I hope and flatter myself that we are at the eve of a fortune, he told Watt. People are daily coming to see the engines. Orders were coming in from Bristol, London, Scotland and Wales, and Bolton was keen that their advantage not be lost to inventors with better engines, quote, serpents like Moses's that devour all others. Soon he was urging Watt to develop a rotary engine that could turn wheels, which would enable it to be used in manufacturing cotton. Watt delivered with his famous Sun and Planet system in 1784. I think flour mills will in the end rival watermills, Bolton predicted. Not all of the visitors in 1776 were potential customers. Some were simply nosy. James Boswell toured the factory out of sheer curiosity and was astonished by, quote, the vastness and the contrivance of some of the machinery. The 700 people who worked for Bolton as an iron chieftain and father to his tribe, and Bolton's zeitgeist embodying remark, quote, I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have, power. Other visitors had more nefarious motives. A group of Cornish mine captains arrived that summer, ostensibly to consider buying an engine, but when they left, Watt noticed that a crucial drawing of the engine design had mysteriously vanished along with them. Bolton responded with a furious letter, insisting that he was running a factory rather than a school to teach fire engine making. The drawing promptly turned up again. It had been taken by one of the mine captains, a certain Richard Trevithick, under a misapprehension, they explained. This incident provides another peculiar link between Watt, Rocket, and the world's first railway accident. Trevithick's son, also named Richard, was only 5 years old when his father tried to snaffle Watt's design in 1776. But he would soon grow into a giant of the steam industry himself. By the age of 25, the younger Trevithick had built a model of a new kind of engine powered by high-pressure steam rather than atmospheric pressure. It was smaller, simpler, and more portable than Watt's atmospheric engine, and this was vital if movable fire engines were ever going to be possible. Trevithick did not stop there. At 30, he was the first to build a working locomotive, announcing the arrival of steam travel in breathtaking fashion by riding his puffing Devil up Camborne Hill without warning and to widespread astonishment on Christmas Eve 1801. The locomotive didn't survive until the new year, after its drivers went off to the pub for the evening, leaving it unattended in a shed with the engine still on. It quickly boiled dry and then burst into flames, and, quote, nothing that was combustible remained either of the engine or the house. At 35, Trevithick started work on a tunnel under the River Thames, which was never completed. At 40, he was declared bankrupt. At 45, he left for South America to make his fortune in mining, but quickly got swept up in the fight for independence under Simón Bolívar, in the course of which he designed a new gun for the army, fled from the Spanish in Peru, crossed the jungle on foot, narrowly escaped being eaten by an alligator, and finally wound up in Cartagena, Colombia, where he managed to persuade a young Englishman to lend him £50 for his ticket home. In an extraordinary coincidence, after spending more than a decade 5,000 miles from home, Richard Trevithick had bumped into one of only 2 people on Earth who knew more about steam locomotives than he did. The young Englishman's name was Robert Stephenson, and 2 years later, he designed and built Rocket. Industrial man cannot live by steam alone. Engines were harbingers of the future, but they would have been rather pointless and indeed impossible to make if they hadn't developed in symbiosis with British manufacturing. Engines needed parts, factories needed power. Neither could bring about industrialization on their own, but in combination they would prove transformative. The transformation in British manufacturing was multifaceted, and so is the explanation for it. But we can summarize it as the product of metals, mechanization, management, marketing, and money. Metals. Britain is undoubtedly lucky in her allocation of coal. There's plenty of it, mostly at or near the Earth's surface, and the location of her coalfields means that even in the 18th century, coal could be transported to major population centres, most notably London, with relative ease. But her subterranean good fortune does not end there. Her geological history has also given her an impressive diversity of metals, copper, lead, tin, zinc, and iron in particular, which are often found near each other. Moreover, many deposits of iron ore happen to be found near rich seams of coal. which is one major reason why Britain was able to produce iron and steel so abundantly and so early. The other is the diligence, know-how, and persistence of four pioneering individuals. In 1709, at Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, Abraham Darby had made the first breakthrough of the industrial age, producing cast iron using coke, which is baked coal, as opposed to charcoal. 40 years later, Benjamin Huntsman worked out how to use clay crucibles for the production of high-quality steel in Sheffield. This was a significant advance because steel, though far stronger and less brittle than iron, was also fiendishly difficult to forge. John Iron Mad Wilkinson's boring machine was probably the first machine tool and critical to the manufacture of precision instruments and components. And high-quality iron became much cheaper thanks to Henry Court's puddling and rolling technique, which enabled people to use coke to make wrought iron, the type used to make nails, pipes, nuts, and bolts, and was described in 1786 as, quote, more advantageous to Great Britain than the possession of the 13 colonies of America. The effect of all these innovations was to dramatically increase British production of iron and steel at precisely the point in history when it was most needed to make tools, engines, and machinery. The chronological alignment is remarkable. In the year that steelmaker Benjamin Huntsman died, Abraham Darby III was commissioned to build the world's first iron bridge, Henry Court started running his first iron forge, and blowers were installed at John Wilkinson's ironworks in Broseley, powered by Boulton and Watt's brand new steam engine. That year, of course, was 1776. Mechanization. The most obvious feature of early British industrialization, at least from the perspective of today, is the use of machines. Watermills, wheels, turning machines, lathes, and eventually engines proliferated. Though mechanization would later be seen as dehumanizing and grotesque, as we've already seen in Manchester, it initially prompted a mixture of admiration and wonder. When Italian author Carlo Castone visited Boulton's factory, he described the use of machinery as, quote, the most interesting and well-done part of English industry, in which wheels, vices, pincers, pedals, lathes, sewing awls, scissors, and hammers, dropping from a height, meant that women, men, and children do a huge amount of work with little effort. Elizabeth Montagu, founder of the Bluestocking Society, found it exquisite, quote, to behold the secrets of chemistry and the mechanic powers so employed and exerted is very delightful. I consider the machines you have at work as so many useful subjects to Great Britain. The idea, as James Keir put it, was, quote, to convert such trades as were usually carried on by individuals into great manufacturers by the help of machinery, which might enable the articles to be made with greater precision and cheaper than those commonly sold. Nowhere was the impact of mechanization greater than in the manufacture of cotton. There were 5 major new inventions in the cotton industry between 1765 and 1785: the spinning jenny, the water frame, Samuel Crompton's mule, Arkwright's carding machine, and Edmund Cartwright's power loom, which dramatically increased the amount of cotton that could be carded, spun, and weaved at once, thus increasing production, lowering costs, and driving demand all at the same time. But machines were doing more of the heavy lifting across the board, cutting patterns for Wedgwood's pots, boring cylinders for Galton's guns, polishing Bolton's buttons, and powering Wilkinson's ironworks and Trevithick's mines. Mechanization was spreading, transforming every industry it touched. Erasmus Darwin could not contain his enthusiasm, although we might wish he had. Quote, pressed by the ponderous air the piston falls, resistless sliding through its iron walls. Quick moves the balanced beam of giant birth, wields his large limbs and nodding shakes the earth. Management. Separating complex processes into simpler ones, whereby 10 people are assigned one task each rather than one person doing 10, is such a basic feature of our world that we can forget how astonishing it was to many at the time. Jabez Fisher, visiting Bolton's factory from Philadelphia in 1776, described, quote, a theatre of business, all conducted like one piece of mechanism, men, women, and children full of employment according to their strength and docility. The very air buzzes with the variety of noises. All seems like one vast machine. 'Tis wonderful, astonishing, amazing. The German aphorist Georg Christoph Lichtenberg was similarly impressed. Quote, each workman has only a very limited range, so that he does not need constantly to change his position and tools, and by this means an incredible amount of time is saved. Thus, for example, each button, fashioned in boxwood, ivory, or anything else, passes through at least 10 hands. By breaking production down into small pieces, managers could maximize productivity, minimize the skills required of each worker, and defend against industrial espionage all at once. The division of labor changed everything. It was, as Adam Smith declared in the opening sentence of The Wealth of Nations, also written in 1776, responsible for, quote, the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied. Equally, however, Smith realized that it risked turning minds into mere hands. This separation of intellectual and manual labor would later be severely criticized by Karl Marx, with sweeping consequences. Factories presented all sorts of new management challenges, and their owners had to work out how to solve them. Some were financial. Wedgwood was one of the first to examine his production costs in detail, negotiate with his workers over the cost of each piece of pottery, increase production in order to minimize the cost of overheads per unit, making the greatest quantity possible in a given time, as he put it, and recognize that lowering prices of his wares could actually increase profits because more of the middling people could afford to buy them. Other challenges related to the practicalities of managing a large workforce. Wedgwood's factory had a system for checking in and out, set meal times, high standards of cleanliness and language, and a process to prevent people from starting their shifts late. Wedgwood, Bolton, and Arkwright all imposed fines for bad behavior, skiving, drunkenness, theft, vandalism. In Jedediah Strutt's factory, offences included, quote, riding on each other's backs, throwing tea on Josh Bridworth, calling through window to some soldiers, putting Josh Haynes' dog into a bucket of hot water, and throwing water on Anne Gregory very frequently. But there were carrots as well as sticks. Wedgwood employed a midwife and 3 apothecaries. Bolton distributed gifts for good work and arranged for an insurance scheme in the case of sickness, injury, or death. Both men, like Arkwright, built homes for their workers. The management of people, as well as financial accounts, would become increasingly important for industrialists in the years ahead. Marketing. In some ways, Josiah Wedgwood was an unlikely potter. The youngest of 13 children, he saw the family pottery pass to his older brother Thomas, to whom he was later apprenticed. He was physically unable to kick the treadle to turn the potter's wheel, thanks to a childhood bout of smallpox that left him with permanent pain in his right knee, which was later sawn off. But he had a flair for what we now call marketing. He practically invented it. Loss leaders, celebrity endorsements, traveling salesmen, advertisements, catalogs, buy one get one free, direct mail, public relations campaigns, free delivery, and money-back guarantees all go back to Josiah Wedgwood. He was arguably the first manufacturer to think seriously about why ordinary people bought things, where they heard about them, and how they could be persuaded to buy more. He was quick to see the power of what we would now call influencer endorsements. Making tea sets for the royal family was laborious and relatively unprofitable, so many potters declined the orders. But Wedgwood realized that it was extremely effective at getting other people to buy them, so he accepted royal commissions, both at home and abroad. Quote, if a royal or noble introduction be as necessary to the sale of an article of luxury as real elegance and beauty, then the manufacturer, if he consults his own interest, will bestow as much pains and expense too, if necessary, in gaining the favour of these advantages as he would in bestowing the latter. Wedgwood reacted to fashions quickly, responding to the fad for hand bleaching by pointing out that his black basalt teaware would create a tasteful contrast. Knowing that his wealthier customers, quote, will not mix with the rest of the world any farther than their amusements or conveniencies make it necessary, he established exclusive showrooms for them. Famously, he mass-produced abolitionist medallions, featuring a kneeling slave in chains made from black basalt against a background of white jasper, surrounded by the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And most far-sightedly, he recognized that the future of his trade lay with selling large numbers of reasonably priced products to the middling class of people rather than small numbers of expensive items to the rich. This was counterintuitive in many industries, and nowhere more so than in the manufacturing of tea sets and tableware. But Wedgwood had seen the future. The middling people would probably buy quantities of them at a reduced price, he explained. Needless to say, none of these four things would have brought about a transformation in British manufacturing if it was not for the availability of the fifth one, money. But that is a subject that needs more space than we can give it here. We will return to it in Chapter 9. It is something of a cliché to say that the Industrial Revolution's greatest invention was invention itself. But like most clichés, it's essentially true. Even if we limit ourselves to the innovations in mining, metallurgy, engine design, and manufacturing we have mentioned so far, it is striking how many significant breakthroughs occurred in the 1770s. And not only relative to the 1470s or the 570s, which we might have expected, but also relative to the 1970s or even the 2010s, which we might not. There were countless others. Watt also developed a copying machine, the screw micrometer, the rangefinder telemeter, and the flexible water main. Priestley invented the eraser, Edgeworth the optical telegraph, Darwin the canal lift and horizontal windmill. The year 1776 also saw the world's first submarine, David Bushnell's Turtle, used by the Continental Army against the British in New York Harbor. It failed. Washington told Jefferson that one accident or another was always intervening, although he still considered it an effort of genius. A few months earlier, in 1775, Alexander Cumming had invented the one item from this period that you almost certainly have in your home, the S-trap toilet, which prevents foul smells from entering the bathroom through the waste pipe. It was improved in 1778 by Joseph Bramah, who then went on to invent the unpickable lock and the hydraulic press. In spring 1774, Benjamin Jesty discovered something that would make an even greater contribution to human well-being than either flush toilets or steam engines, when he deliberately infected his wife and sons with cowpox. The Turkish practice of inoculation, or deliberately infecting people with smallpox, had been introduced to Britain decades earlier. But Jesty took it to the next level by infecting humans with pus from a cow's udders using a darning needle. He was widely ridiculed for making his family ill on purpose, with some claiming cowpox would give them horns. They quickly recovered, however, and by the end of the century, the practice of vaccination, from the Latin vacca for cow, would be vindicated by Edward Jenner as both safer than inoculation and less likely to lead to transmission. Smallpox was finally eradicated in 1980. Here is what's curious about each of these innovations. They were all made by English-speaking people. This is odd, because science was advancing across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, not just in Britain. We have already seen how new physical laws, mathematical formulae, biological species, and chemical elements were being identified all over the continent. Another good example of scientific internationalism in this period is electricity. To this day, we measure electrical components using volts, watts, amps, and ohms, reflecting the contributions of Italian, Scottish, French, and German scientists, respectively. Yet when we strip out experiments with purely theoretical or curiosity value, and focus instead on practical inventions that changed the way individuals, businesses, and entire nations operated, like pumps, engines, tools, locks, machines, factories, toilets, vaccines, and trains, the list becomes disproportionately Anglophone, with nearly all of them created in England, Wales, Scotland, or America. Which invites the question, why? There are a variety of explanations. One is geography. Britain was fast running out of wood, so she had to find an alternative source of fuel, and coal, which was plentiful and accessible, was the ideal candidate, which soon prompted experiments and inventions to mine it more efficiently, which then had knock-on effects in the production of iron and steam. Another is the role of the state. The combination of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, economic protectionism, and more or less continual warmongering by the British state in the 18th century provided favourable conditions for the growth of various industries, including cotton, textiles, munitions, and metalwork. A third is relatively high wages, which incentivized the development of labour-saving machinery. A fourth is the improvement of the British travel network in the second half of the century, which witnessed a dramatic expansion in the number of turnpike roads, as well as the start of a canal boom that would make the transport of goods far cheaper, thanks in no small part to the efforts of lunar men like Darwin, Wedgwood, Small, and Bolton. But material factors like minerals, wages, wars, and roads do not tell the whole story. We can see that from the counterexample of France in particular, whose natural resources, militarization, transport networks, and wages were roughly equivalent to Britain's, if not greater. Ideas played a role too. They always do. Take religion, for instance. The inventors we've met so far were virtually all Protestant. Most of them were nonconformist as well, even though dissenters made up less than 10% of the British population. Naturally, there is plenty of debate as to why this might be true. Is it the intellectual freedom that comes from being outside the mainstream of acceptable thought? Is it the Protestant work ethic, in which hard work is proof that you are part of the elect? Is it the high view of diligence, education, and useful knowledge found among the Puritans? Is it the lack of church meddling in scientific matters, in contrast to the colleges in France, where the Jesuits insisted on Cartesianism being taught rather than Newtonian mechanics? Is it the greater levels of literacy, generated by the Protestant emphasis on reading the Bible? Is it a classic example of the creative minority principle, in which people who are excluded from traditional power structures have to find other ways to rise up in the world? It may have been any of these, a combination, or something else entirely, and it's very difficult to prove which. But whichever explanations we choose, the correlation between religion and invention in this period is too strong to be overlooked. Or take the idea behind the success, and indeed the very existence, of the Lunar Society. Most cultures in history have had clear blue water between intellectuals and craftsmen, thinkers and doers, Lichfield philosophers and Birmingham boobies. You can either pursue knowledge or power, theoretical truth or practical utility, but not both. And the thinkers usually look down on the doers. But in early modern England, that paradigm began to change. In a series of works, Francis Bacon called for the savants to join forces with the fabricants, the knowers with the makers, in order to seek understanding that was practically useful. Contemplating truth is all well and good, he wrote in 1592, but surely our aim should be, quote, the happy match between the mind of man and the nature of things in order to produce worthy effects and to endow the life of man with infinite commodities. Bacon's ideas soon took root. In 1663, Robert Boyle confessed his relative lack of interest in, quote, pleasing speculations to entertain man's understanding without at all increasing his power. He then applied the principle to himself, quote, I shall not dare to think myself a true naturalist till my skill can make my garden yield better herbs and flowers, or my orchard better fruit, or my field better corn, or my dairy better cheese, than theirs that are strangers to physiology. Thomas Sprat went further, arguing that philosophy, quote, will attain perfection when either mechanic labourers shall have philosophical heads, or the philosophers shall have mechanical hands. This did not happen overnight, of course, nor exclusively in Britain. But it was in Britain, more than anywhere else, that Bacon's vision for the purpose of science, to endow human life with new discoveries and resources, became a reality. Ideas have consequences. Another example is the idea that inventions are a form of property. Today we take intellectual property for granted. It seems right to us that people who come up with new ideas should have the opportunity to profit from them for a period of time, without other people copying their ideas and peddling their own imitations. Indeed, by providing a financial incentive for the first and true inventor of a new product, patents are foundational to our pursuit of innovation. But that idea is by no means a universal one. It evolved in 17th and 18th century Britain, emerging from the work of men like Bacon, Edward Coke, and John Locke, and finding legal expression in the Statute on Monopolies, 1623-4, the Copyright Act, 1710, and the Engraving Copyright Act, 1734-5. These laws were not without problems, and eventually became the subject of significant controversies involving Watt, Bolton, Trevithick, Arkwright, Darwin, and many others. But without them, And without the underlying assumption that ideas were something you could own, it is highly unlikely that Matthew Boulton would have put up the money for James Watt's steam engine, or that Watt would have bothered persevering with it. Of all things in life, Watt remarked just 3 months after receiving his patent, there is nothing more foolish than inventing. Necessity is not the mother of invention. It provides a powerful incentive to think of better ways of doing things, and this is undoubtedly important. But historically speaking, inventions typically come from the privileged rather than those in desperate need, because innovation flourishes where there are not only incentives, but also expertise, resources, time to experiment, and freedom to fail. For a variety of geographical, economic, political, religious, intellectual, and legal reasons, those conditions were more fully met in Britain and America than in most of Europe in the late 18th century, and this generated a virtuous circle in which steam power, manufacturing, and invention developed symbiotically, with each drawing life from the other two. The lunar men and their friends seized the moment and shot for the moon. Maybe Prometheus was the first industrialist. He stole the secrets of fire from the gods in order to share them with humanity, and they brought huge power, enabling great progress in the arts and sciences. But they also brought unintended consequences of suffering and conflict. There is something unmistakably Promethean, for example, about Benjamin Franklin snatching fire from the heavens with a key and a kite. Matthew Boulton's quest for power, with which we started this chapter, is similarly audacious. The same spirit characterizes Erasmus Darwin and John Whitehurst as they rummage underground for wonders that might fuel fire engines. And indeed, Richard Trevithick's boast that while others had put the boiler in the fire, he had put the fire in the boiler. There is something Promethean, too, about the ambiguous aftermath. Eiffel's Tower and Tocqueville's sewer, the power and danger of Stephenson's rocket, the military consequences of industrial technology. You can see why the poets of the first industrial generation, including Goethe, Byron, and Shelley, found the Promethean myth such a source of creative inspiration. The most famous example was the extraordinary novel The Modern Prometheus, written by Mary Shelley, wife of Percy, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and the anarchist William Godwin, when she was just 18. Generally recognized as the first piece of science fiction, it's a tale of scientific progress gone awry. Several of the inventors we have met in this chapter appear in the novel. There are allusions early on to Franklin's work on lightning and Luigi Galvani's on bioelectricity, from which we get our word galvanize, alongside various developments in chemistry and steam, and Erasmus Darwin appears in the book's first sentence. Besides being a novel, it is a parable of the dangers of industrial knowledge. An eager young student goes to university in Ingolstadt. He learns for the first time about chemistry, and particularly electricity, and marvels at the wondrous possibilities of modern science. Quote, "These philosophers whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or the crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers." So he resolves to use these powers for good, either by abolishing disease or by overcoming death. But his experiment backfires terribly. He creates something that is far beyond his control, like fire and indeed industrialization, unleashing alienation, horror, the destruction of children, families, and communities, and death. Eventually, he comes to understand what responsibilities creators have towards their creatures, but it is too late to save him. The reader is left pondering whether the benefits of technology outweigh the dangers of creating a monster that we cannot control, and which might at any moment wreak havoc upon our communities, our children, and our very planet. The same question haunts one of the great TV series of recent times, Craig Mazin's Chernobyl. Today, we know Mary Shelley's novel by its other title, Frankenstein. In a sense, industrialization was indeed a monster. It unleashed all sorts of consequences that would have horrified the lunar men. From Dickensian London and 19th century Chicago to machine guns, nuclear weapons, and climate change. Communities and family structures that had been stable for thousands of years were swept away in a matter of decades, with profound consequences for the practice of Christianity. Landscapes were destroyed. Millions of human beings were reduced to machines. Weaponry became immeasurably more deadly and sophisticated, with devastating consequences. As Captain Blood puts it in Hilaire Belloc's poem, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." Today, for every mile of railway track in the world, there are 100 AK-47s. Yet for all that, industrialization, like fire, is a Promethean triumph as well as a Frankensteinian monster. Which of the two metaphors predominates, whether running water compensates for Hiroshima, or antibiotics for the Somme, or the growth in wealth for the overweening pride that accompanies it, probably depends on where you are sitting.
What a way to end.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a good one. I really enjoy that chapter, but that's my second time going through it. So how are you guys digesting that?
It's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. There's a lot of thoughts, namely that we are in the, we talk about multiple industrial revolutions, like the first, the second, the third. I think
Mhm.
all of those intermediate ones don't really count. There are people being like, oh yeah, like this is another revolution. And it's like, no, this is the only one happening now that is anywhere close to what happened then. And we need like another name for it of like, I was thinking it's like, oh, the autonomy revolution, and autonomous are the ones who are pushing it forward to have some sort of crescendo in the next couple of years.
That's a take. So you're saying the second industrial revolution pales in comparison to the first. And obviously, like we just heard so many things in the first industrial revolution. And you're saying the AI moment we're in now, like there's so many things that are similar in the timelines and the power and potential for destruction. Yeah, I don't know if I'd go as far as you, but I am maybe more of an AI skeptic.
I'm sure there are skeptics of the steam engine being inside a car at some point, right? The fire chariot.
Classic. A
Yeah.
classic. I will admit, like, I forget if it was Franklin or whatever, after the submarine, didn't work. It's like, it's still pretty powerful, still an amazing invention. And sure enough. Anyways, Austin, how are you?
I think the one thing that I'm struck with the most is just the need for maybe a humility in the face of unfolding history. I mean, it's easy to retrospect the first and second industrial revolution and to see all that in hindsight, but this took place over a long period of time with a lot of ups and downs and false starts and hiccups and twists and turns and unexpected developments. And it's like, if we're really in the middle of that right now, we ought to learn from that period of history, and the people who tried to predict history as it was unfolding, and realize that very few people batted even anywhere close to 1,000 on that. A lot of stuff was said, and a lot of hype was shared for things that didn't materialize. There were unexpected developments along the way, and if we are truly in an analogous moment, we ought to learn with some humility. Just we don't know what comes next. We don't know what developments are yet in store. We don't know what twists and turns and plot twists might happen. It'll only be in hindsight that the true it'll only be in hindsight that we'll truly actually know what's going on. Like if at this immediate moment, we see a lot of things happening, but we can't know what tomorrow holds, much less what next year holds or the next 10 years holds. And we can extrapolate from current trends, but people were doing that then too. And some of them were right, and a good number of them were wrong. And that's going to be the same for us too.
Yeah. There's the basic of, steam engine could lead to vehicles, but to get from A to B, it's actually from A to F, and there's a whole lot of things in between.
Yeah. And I think it really is good to look at history, they always say history is a really good teacher, right? Because things can rhyme. And I think people, especially in today's age, have lost that art of like really digesting um, how things happened in the past, and like, oh, like in the closing remarks, there's like Frankenstein, right? Or Promethean, right? So it's like there's people probably jumping up in arms around data center equivalents back then, you know? It's like, but
He
Sure.
didn't even go into the Luddites. That was on one of the pages I was looking at. It's like the Luddites are the easy example. I think he talks about it in a different chapter.
right, yeah.
Yeah, and I've maintained that like now with data centers, especially like the whole Luddite comparison, it takes on a much darker a much darker connotation of like we don't. I still maintain that we do not want that aspect of the Luddite history to be recovered because it just doesn't. It's going to fail for one. Neil Postman was actually like very explicit about that in Technopoly. It's like they all failed. Every single one of them failed, and they lost. And I think that's the same here too with those that are like, yeah, we should bomb the data centers. It's like, no, stop. What are you doing?
Yeah. Andrew, I do want to go back to your skepticism on how big this revolution is. And I think it's more as I'm like unpacking the reflection on that passage. The Industrial Revolution, obviously, there was like so many factors that was explained there. But really, the ability to do labor with quote unquote nothing, right? It's like the mill, and you could use like nature, you could harness that to do labor. That I feel was one of the most important components that led to this explosion of quote unquote productivity. And I think what we're seeing now with this autonomy revolution is that, yes, you can use machines, but you still needed someone to control the machine. You needed an operator. Now we're moving into an era where the machine can finally control itself to an extent. You just need someone to give it that commission and like maintain it to an extent of where it's breaking down. And that, AI is one component like steam. We don't call it the steam revolution. We call it the industrial revolution. So similarly, like we're not going to call this the AI revolution. It will be autonomy because AI will lead to robots that colonize the moon, to like people having that in their home, to all of this displacement of job and labor and everything like that, which is on the same scale of like displacement we went through before. Like internets was a revolution. Internet is like huge, but it didn't do that displacement of like how we actually do most of our jobs. We still is very linear to an extent.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think at this present moment, the internet remains much more of analogous to the Industrial Revolution than AI does. I think AI will eventually get there, but I don't think it's there right now.
No, yeah, we're definitely in the earlier stage, but like the internet is actually like on a broader spectrum of computing,
Sure.
right? So it's like I think like if you actually like look at the internet, it's like okay, we're connecting multiple computers, but it was actually related to the computing innovation versus AI is
Okay, that's fair.
more not about computing, but about autonomy.
It's all these factors together. Like it's the same as Andrew Wilson describes it in the book is you can't just say it's because of coal mining. You can't say it was just because of the machines. Like there was the marketing element too, which I was looking at your reaction, Austin, when he was going through that section of like the invention of marketing is certainly a curveball in history.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes, it is.
I was thinking about this because I was thinking about church discipline in a local church pre-marketing revolution versus now. And just the way the early church allowed for people to just come in and speak or Judaism, like Jesus was able to go into a synagogue and say, I have something to share. And then he was allowed to share it, even though he was just a dude. You can't do that at a church anymore because now we're in like a marketing hype cycle. People are looking for fame. It's just a whole different culture. So the process of someone randomly speaking up on a Sunday morning, it's probably something that is downstream from this marketing revolution, as opposed to something that would have been allowed prior to. So our churches have changed because of the ability to have just a random stranger come into your church and speak. Just doesn't make sense in 2026.
Right.
Like there's all these little changes that when we look at history, it helps us read the Bible better. It helps us love our neighbor better. It helps us to contextualize where we are, regardless of these AI moment that we're in. And we'll have to come back to this stuff in other episodes. At the end of the day, it's I think the humility that you referenced, Austin, at the beginning. I think that's one of the key points to end on.
Yeah, like we don't know what tomorrow holds, and we don't know where this is going. We don't know even in this year. I mean, if we look back at what happened in 2025, how you started 2025 and how you ended 2025, I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. And I think it's going to just be more and more true with each passing year. So just hold on tight and keep listening to this podcast because we'll guide you along the way.
That's right. Well, thank you to Andrew Wilson for joining us through the ability of the internet, not the ability of AI just yet. That was him reading it for his audiobook, which you can purchase on Crossway's website. It's also available wherever you get books. So you can get the audio version where he himself is reading it. I think I mentioned that at the beginning, but if not, mentioning it now. He's a great pastor, speaker, etc., and a great book. So I wholly endorse this book, Remaking the World. And thank you to Crossway for allowing us to use it, the whole chapter in this episode. And to follow along, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you're on YouTube. And if you will, you can support us on Patreon to support us in doing more work like this. We're a little bit quieter during the summer, but on Patreon, there is something coming out about something that is pretty exciting.
You just gotta see it to believe it. You just got to see it to believe it.
It's something that you can click and you can run on your computer, and it will be an experience that is unlike anything you've ever had before. On our Patreon page, that is coming probably by the time this episode drops. And thank you for listening. Use tech, find rest, glorify God. Take care.
See ya.
See y'all.